Miami Harbor, 2:47 a.m. A freight vessel rests silently beneath dock illumination, its enormous frame creating lengthy shadows over the sea. The atmosphere carries scents of diesel and brine, combined with the mechanical aromas that permanently linger around harbor installations. Even throughout the most tranquil nighttime hours, within the ship's interior, a worker in uniform guides a refuse trolley along a confined passageway. He goes by Diego Ramos, and his limbs remain entirely stable, regardless of his imminent actions. His respiration stays composed and controlled, the outcome of extensive planning and arrangements for this precise instant. Within exactly 23 minutes, Diego will depart this vessel carrying 11 million in criminal organization funds concealed within standard garbage receptacles. No weapons discharged, no warnings activated, no brutality whatsoever. Merely a custodian with cleaning supplies, a strategy, and 2 decades of remaining entirely unnoticed by those surrounding him. The monitoring devices positioned across the ship's hallways record everything, yet they display nothing dubious, simply a sanitation employee performing precisely what sanitation employees accomplish during these nighttime hours, transporting refuse bins containing waste toward the departure platform, clearing receptacles with the systematic proficiency of someone who has executed identical duties countless times, adhering to his standard procedure precisely to the minute, preserving the identical tempo he's employed for months laboring aboard this ship. The weaponized sentries at the inspection point scarcely raise their gaze from their devices as Diego nears with 3 secured waste receptacles, each weighing substantially more than expected. Simply garbage, one states afterward during the FBI questioning that will ensue. Identical individual who's been sanitizing this path for months, never created difficulties, never provided us reason to examine twice. They possessed absolutely no awareness that those standard-appearing containers hold more currency than most individuals witness in 10 lifetimes together. The robbery itself requires under 18 minutes from beginning to completion. By 3:15 a.m., Diego walks down the boarding ramp as he has countless times previously, propelling his sanitation cart with the identical unhurried rhythm that has rendered him invisible to security staff for months. By 3:30 a.m., he's traveling northward on I-95 in a leased vehicle, following a purposely roundabout path toward the Mexican frontier, while law enforcement officers throughout Miami maintain their regular patrols, entirely oblivious that the most significant theft in maritime records has just transpired at their city's main harbor installation. By daybreak, he's already changed vehicles twice and eliminated every identification document linking him to his former existence. Diego Ramos has just accomplished what federal investigators will subsequently characterize as the most skilled robbery in maritime records, and he's achieved it by leveraging the single element that enabled it. Within a reality of continuous monitoring and strict protection, nobody truly observes a custodian. The unnoticed individual has just transformed into the wealthiest criminal in South Florida. Diego Ramos had remained unnoticed throughout most of his mature existence, and he comprehended that invisibility represented both a burden and a capability that could be utilized by someone intelligent enough to acknowledge its possibilities. At 44 years of age, he had devoted precisely 20 years sanitizing vessels that anchored in harbors from Miami to Galveston to New Orleans, laboring for companies who competed for cleaning contracts for everything from luxury passenger ships to commercial freight vessels. He represented the type of laborer that people's vision simply passes by without acknowledgement, a person who had become operationally equivalent to cleaning machinery in the consciousness of everyone he met. Silent when necessary, dependable like quality equipment is dependable, consistently available when the vessel required cleaning, entirely forgotten once the labor was completed. Originating from a small settlement beyond Guatemala City, where power was unreliable and flowing water represented luxury, Diego had entered the United States in 2003 with nothing except resolve, $47 in currency, and a relative's assurance of employment in Florida. The expedition had consumed 3 weeks, mostly spent traversing desert landscape and concealing from Border Patrol officers who would have returned him to destitution that offered no remedies. He acquired English by observing other custodians during rest periods, absorbing vocabulary and syntax through thousands of discussions in storage rooms and maintenance areas where immigrant laborers exchanged survival techniques in a nation that required their work but refused to recognize their humanity. He obtained his Transportation Security Administration Harbor Facility Security Authorization after 2 years of background investigations, interviews, and administrative processes that demanded he demonstrate trustworthiness sufficient to labor in restricted zones around vessels transporting international freight. The authorization had cost him $800 in charges and required submission to fingerprinting, substance screening, and a thorough examination of every location where he had resided since arriving in the United States. However, it justified the expenditure because the authorization provided him entry to zones where consistent employment was accessible for individuals willing to perform jobs that American laborers deemed below their status. He discovered steady work with Maritime Sanitation Services, a company that managed cleaning for everything from luxury passenger vessels to commercial freight ships. The business was owned by a Greek immigrant who recognized the worth of employing laborers who would appear reliably, work diligently without protests, and never inquire about freight or travelers that weren't their concern. The compensation was adequate to transmit funds home to his relatives in Guatemala while sustaining a humble lifestyle in a shared residence in Hialeah. The schedule was lengthy but foreseeable, with most duties beginning after midnight when vessels were anchored and freight activities were halted. Most significantly, it represented honest labor, and that held deep importance for a man supporting 2 offspring and an aged mother back in Guatemala. Across 2 decades, Diego had cultivated comprehensive understanding of how vessels actually operated versus how they were intended to operate according to official records. He understood which passages remained entirely vacant after midnight because crew members avoided particular routes during off-duty hours, either due to superstitions or practical worries about zones where incidents were more probable. He grasped where surveillance cameras contained blind areas due to inadequate installation, insufficient maintenance, or obstruction from the ship's structural components that blocked viewing angles. He had committed to memory how waste management systems functioned at every major harbor installation along the Gulf Coast, including which inspection points were operated by guards who actually observed what occurred around them, and which were staffed by individuals merely calculating hours until their duties concluded. Most critically, Diego had realized something that would prove essential to his future strategies. Custodians exist in a condition of operational invisibility that extends well beyond simple absence of attention. Individuals observe the uniform and the cleaning equipment, but they don't perceive the person within the uniform. Security personnel direct cleaning teams through restricted inspection points without actually studying faces or verifying identification thoroughly because maintenance workers are presumed harmless by nature. Ship officials automatically move aside to allow maintenance personnel to pass without wondering what those workers might be noting or planning while they navigate through sensitive zones. In a contemporary world controlled by surveillance cameras, biometric scanners, and constant security measures, the individual pushing a cleaning bucket navigates through restricted spaces with nearly complete liberty. This invisibility had always represented Diego's burden, a reminder that he was regarded as less significant than the labor he executed. But soon it would become his most powerful asset. The MV Esperanza represented a medium-sized freight vessel that operated regular paths between Cartagena, Colombia, and various harbors along the American Gulf Coast, with Miami serving as its primary destination for freight requiring rapid processing through customs installations. The vessel was documented in Panama under flag of convenience agreements that offered tax benefits and regulatory adaptability, managed by a legitimate shipping corporation with facilities in 3 nations, and transported primarily legal freight like coffee, textiles, and manufactured products from South America. According to its official records, the Esperanza was precisely what it seemed, a standard commercial vessel participating in legitimate international commerce. Diego had been designated to clean this specific vessel roughly once every 3 weeks for the previous 8 months, and he understood its design better than most crew members who actually labored aboard it permanently. He comprehended the ship's air circulation systems, its electrical arrangements, its freight storage configurations, and its security measures in detail that would have impressed maritime engineers. However, during a standard cleaning duty in early March, Diego observed something that didn't correspond with any of his earlier visits to the Esperanza. Deck 3 had consistently been classified as restricted entry on Diego's cleaning assignment documents provided by Maritime Sanitation Services. According to official records, it housed crew accommodations, officer storage zones, and sensitive navigation machinery that demanded specialized authorization to access. Diego's duties never encompassed that level, and he had never challenged the limitation because vessels maintained complicated hierarchies and security measures that custodians learned early not to question. Inquiring too extensively about zones they couldn't access represented a rapid method to forfeit harbor security authorization and become jobless. However, on March 12th, while Diego was cleaning the primary corridor that connected to the Deck 3 access stairway, he witnessed something that caused him to focus much closer attention on that restricted zone and begin questioning assumptions he had accepted without examination. Two individuals were transporting sealed wooden containers down to Deck 3, moving with the careful accuracy of professionals managing valuable freight. The containers were approximately the dimensions of large luggage, labeled with official-appearing stamps and shipping tags that stated industrial machinery, fragile, handle with caution, and they were managing them with the type of intentional care that indicated the contents were far more valuable than typical ship supplies. More notably, both individuals carried pistols visible in shoulder holsters beneath their coats, which was highly uncommon because legitimate freight operations rarely demanded armed protection, especially for machinery that was supposedly intended for routine delivery to commercial clients. Diego continued his cleaning duties without displaying any response that might suggest he had noticed anything unusual, but he began focusing systematic attention on patterns and details surrounding Deck 3 that he had previously disregarded. During the following several weeks, he noted that the identical two armed individuals appeared on the vessel during particular voyages, consistently when the Esperanza was returning from Colombia to Miami, never during departing trips when the vessel was carrying legitimate export freight to South America. They sustained a constant presence near the Deck 3 access location, operating in 12-hour duties with military accuracy, and they handled that zone like it contained something requiring professional protection rather than standard freight management. During a smoking break in late March, Diego situated himself near a ventilation opening where discussions from Deck 3 transmitted clearly through the ship's air distribution system. He overheard a telephone discussion between one of the guards and someone he addressed respectfully as El Jefe. The discussion was conducted in Spanish, with the guard apparently presuming that nobody nearby would comprehend Colombian dialect or focus on what appeared like routine communication. Identical schedule as usual, the guard stated in Spanish, speaking softly but not whispering because he believed his discussion was private. Collection occurs 40 miles from Miami. We sustain position until anchoring. What amount this occasion? The voice on the telephone inquired. The connection was clear enough that Diego could hear both sides of the discussion through the ventilation system. 11 million, all currency, mixed denominations, vacuum sealed according to procedure. No difficulties with the path. Smooth as usual. Nobody focuses on maintenance personnel. Diego's hands continued clearing a nearby waste receptacle without any alteration in rhythm or tempo, but his thoughts were suddenly racing with possibilities he had never contemplated previously. $11 million in currency, moving regularly through a vessel he had been cleaning for months, protected by guards who had grown so familiar with his presence that they discussed sensitive activities within hearing of his work zone, treating him like part of the ship's infrastructure rather than a person who might be listening and comprehending every statement. That evening, Diego lay wakeful in his small residence in Hialeah, gazing at the ceiling while his mind computed numbers that could transform everything about his existence and his family's prospects. His daughter Maria required surgery to repair a cardiac defect that his insurance wouldn't completely cover, leaving him with medical expenses that would consume years to settle. His son Carlos had been admitted to engineering school at the University of Miami, but couldn't manage the tuition without loans that would burden him for decades. His mother's prescriptions for diabetes and hypertension cost more monthly than Diego earned in a week of cleaning vessels. $11 million would resolve every financial difficulty his family had ever confronted, with enough remaining to ensure they never confronted those difficulties again. However, more than the currency itself, Diego realized something that would prove fundamental for everything that followed. He might be the sole person connected to the Esperanza who was both completely trusted to navigate freely throughout the vessel and entirely invisible to the individuals who were supposed to be maintaining security around their illegal freight. During the following weeks, Diego began conducting his own silent investigation into the ship's actual activities versus its official freight manifest, utilizing his legitimate access as a cleaning contractor to gather intelligence that no law enforcement agency could possibly obtain without months of undercover operations. Diego spent the following month systematically examining every aspect of the Esperanza's activities, utilizing his legitimate access as a cleaning contractor to chart details that no outsider could possibly acquire. He recorded arrival and departure schedules with accuracy that would have impressed naval intelligence officers, noting variations in timing that correlated with weather circumstances, harbor traffic, and customs inspection procedures. He memorized crew rotation timetables, security measures, maintenance requirements, and most importantly, the specific patterns surrounding the mysterious Deck 3 activities that seemed to function according to rules completely separate from the ship's legitimate freight handling. The vessel maintained a precise timetable between Cartagena and Miami, with a complete round trip consuming exactly 18 days under normal weather circumstances. Outbound journeys carried legitimate freight like coffee beans, cut flowers, textiles, and manufactured products that were properly recorded and inspected by customs authorities at both ends of the journey. However, during the return voyage, something additional was loaded aboard during nighttime activities that occurred approximately 40 miles offshore from Miami, well beyond territorial waters where Coast Guard patrols were less frequent and international maritime law provided protection for activities that might not survive examination in American waters. Diego confirmed through careful observation that the currency collection always occurred during the identical phase of each return voyage, following a timetable that was precisely coordinated with other components of what was obviously a sophisticated smuggling operation. The Esperanza would decelerate to a near halt in international waters during the darkest nighttime hours, where it would meet with a smaller vessel that approached without navigation lights and maintained radio silence throughout the transfer activity. The exchange consumed under 30 minutes, with wooden containers being transferred from the smaller boat directly to Deck 3 through a freight opening that was normally sealed during routine activities. The currency remained in a concealed compartment on Deck 3 for exactly 67 hours from collection to delivery in Miami. During that period, it was guarded continuously by two armed individuals who operated 12-hour duties with military discipline and focus. Diego learned their identities by listening to radio communications and observing their interaction patterns. Carlos and Miguel. They were professionals who took their responsibilities seriously, maintained physical conditioning that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds, and followed security procedures that were clearly established through extensive experience with similar activities. However, they possessed one critical vulnerability that Diego began to exploit for intelligence purposes. Both guards had completely stopped noticing his presence during the months he had been cleaning the vessel. Both guards maintained identical routines during every voyage, following patterns that had become so automatic they no longer questioned the wisdom of their established procedures. They would abandon their position for exactly 15 minutes at 3 a.m. to smoke cigarettes on the upper deck because maritime safety regulations prohibited smoking anywhere near freight storage zones, where fuel vapors or other combustible materials might create fire dangers. During those 15 minutes, Deck 3 was completely unguarded while they climbed 2 levels to reach an authorized smoking zone that was equipped with proper ventilation and fire suppression systems. Diego had observed this routine during 3 separate voyages, and the timing never varied by more than 2 or 3 minutes. Carlos and Miguel were disciplined about maintaining security, but they were also creatures of routine who had grown comfortable with their assignment over months of repetition without incident. More importantly, Diego realized that both guards had completely stopped noticing his presence during his regular cleaning duties. He moved freely through corridors adjacent to their position, emptied waste receptacles near their location, and performed maintenance tasks that brought him within a few feet of the Deck 3 access point. To Carlos and Miguel, Diego had become part of the ship's background environment, as invisible and harmless as the ventilation system or the emergency illumination. This provided Diego an unprecedented opportunity to examine the security measures protecting $11 million in criminal organization currency. and he began developing strategies that would exploit weaknesses that the guards didn't even realize existed. The concealed compartment itself was positioned behind a false wall that appeared to be part of the ship's original construction, camouflaged so effectively that it would escape detection during routine inspections by harbor authorities or Coast Guard personnel. It was secured with two high-quality padlocks that appeared to be standard maritime security equipment, but the locks were accessible through a maintenance panel that Diego could reach during his normal cleaning duties without attracting attention from anyone who might be monitoring his activities. The compartment was large enough to contain approximately 6 wooden containers, each one holding roughly $1.8 million in mixed denominations that had been vacuum sealed in plastic and wrapped in waterproof canvas according to professional smuggling procedures designed to protect currency during extended periods of storage in maritime conditions. Diego estimated that the total capacity of the concealed space was sufficient to contain 15 to 20 million, suggesting that the $11 million shipments he had observed represented only a portion of the criminal organization's regular currency transportation activities. Diego spent weeks researching lockpicking methods using internet videos, instructional materials, and practice locks purchased with currency from different stores across Miami to avoid creating patterns that might be noticed by anyone monitoring his activities. He discovered that the specific model of padlocks used on the compartment could be opened in under 60 seconds by someone with the proper tools and sufficient practice. He acquired the necessary equipment from a locksmith supply company, paying currency and using a false identity to avoid creating any paper trail that could later connect him to burglary tools. However, the technical aspects of accessing the currency were only part of Diego's challenge. The real problem was removing $11 million from a heavily monitored harbor facility without triggering any of the multiple security systems designed to prevent exactly that type of theft. Miami Harbor employed hundreds of security personnel, maintained extensive surveillance networks, and operated according to federal regulations that required detailed documentation of all freight movements. Getting the currency out of the vessel would require a strategy that exploited weaknesses in security procedures that even the individuals responsible for maintaining those procedures might not fully comprehend. Diego's solution was elegantly simple and virtually undetectable. He would conceal the currency inside legitimate waste removal activities that occurred during every cleaning duty. Diego's strategy exploited a fundamental weakness in harbor security procedures that he had observed over 20 years of laboring in maritime facilities throughout the Gulf Coast. Security personnel are trained to look for individuals trying to smuggle contraband into restricted zones, not individuals trying to remove things that are already inside those zones. Waste removal activities are considered routine and low risk because nobody assumes that valuable freight would be disposed of as trash. The entire security apparatus is designed to prevent infiltration, not exfiltration, creating blind spots that could be exploited by someone with the proper access and knowledge. Diego would steal the currency during the 15-minute window when both guards left their position for cigarettes, a vulnerability that existed because even professional criminals develop habits that can be predicted and exploited. He would load currency into modified waste receptacles, cover it with legitimate trash from his cleaning rounds throughout the vessel, and wheel it off the ship during normal harbor activities using his established credentials and security authorization that had been verified through months of routine labor. The entire activity would appear exactly like waste disposal that occurred after every cleaning duty, indistinguishable from legitimate activities that security personnel had observed hundreds of times. The beauty of this approach was that Diego's harbor security authorization allowed unrestricted movement through Miami's facilities with cleaning equipment that was rarely subjected to detailed inspection. Guards who had seen him hundreds of times would direct him through inspection points without conducting searches of waste receptacles that appeared to contain ordinary trash from vessel sanitation activities. Even if someone became suspicious later, the currency would be long gone before anyone thought to examine waste disposal procedures that were considered completely routine. Diego began acquiring the specialized equipment he would need for the activity, making purchases at different locations, and using currency to avoid creating records that could later be traced back to him. He purchased 3 heavy-duty waste receptacles with false bottoms that could conceal approximately $2.5 million each, while still appearing to contain normal trash when viewed from above. He modified his cleaning cart to accommodate the additional weight of currency-filled receptacles without showing obvious signs of strain that might attract attention from security personnel. He researched techniques for masking the distinctive smell of large amounts of currency using industrial cleaning chemicals that were part of his normal supply inventory and wouldn't seem suspicious if detected during routine inspections. Most critically, Diego planned his escape path with the same systematic attention to detail that he had applied to studying the vessel's activities and security vulnerabilities. He would drive directly from Miami to the Mexican frontier using back roads and secondary highways that had fewer surveillance cameras and automated license plate recognition systems. He arranged for a rental vehicle using false identification documents that he had obtained through contacts in Miami's immigrant community, paying currency for a week-long rental that would provide plenty of time to reach Mexico without rushing or taking risks that might attract attention. He established contact with smuggling networks in Laredo who could facilitate his frontier crossing in exchange for payment that would represent a tiny fraction of his stolen fortune. These were individuals who specialized in moving high-value freight and individuals across international boundaries without official documentation, and they had established relationships with frontier officials that made their activities virtually undetectable. Diego opened bank accounts in 3 different identities across 2 nations using documentation obtained through the same networks that had provided his false identification. He purchased a small property in rural Honduras through intermediaries who handled the transaction without requiring his physical presence or legitimate identification, creating a safe haven where he could disappear permanently if his escape strategy succeeded. Everything had to be executed perfectly on the first attempt because there would be no opportunity to try again if anything went wrong. The criminal organization would immediately upgrade security measures after discovering the theft, making future attempts impossible. More dangerously, they would begin investigating everyone who had access to their activities, and Diego's invisibility would disappear the moment he became a suspect in their investigation. However, Diego had spent months studying every variable that could affect his strategy, and he was confident that his approach would function exactly as intended. The date was set for April 15th, when the Esperanza was scheduled to dock in Miami carrying its regular shipment of $11 million in currency that would soon belong to a custodian who had learned how to become invisible. April 15th, 11:30 p.m. The Esperanza completed its docking procedures at Miami Harbor exactly on schedule, sliding into berth 47 under massive floodlights that turned night into artificial day across the freight facility. The vessel's arrival was routine in every respect, indistinguishable from thousands of other commercial ships that used Miami as their primary entry point for freight bound for distribution throughout the southeastern United States. Diego watched from the Harbor Authority building as stevedores secured the vessel's mooring lines and connected power cables that would supply electricity during its stay in harbor. His cleaning duty was scheduled to begin at midnight, giving him 4 hours to complete sanitation activities throughout the entire vessel before the next crew arrived for morning freight activities. Diego had performed this same routine dozens of times over the previous 8 months, but tonight felt fundamentally different as he gathered his modified cleaning supplies from the Maritime Sanitation Services storage facility. 3 false bottom waste receptacles that looked identical to standard equipment but could conceal millions of dollars without detection, industrial plastic sheeting that would provide additional waterproofing for the currency during transport, cleaning chemicals with strong odors that would mask any distinctive smell of large amounts of currency. Everything appeared completely normal to the harbor security guard, who inspected his identification and checked his name against the authorized personnel list that granted him access to restricted zones. At exactly midnight, Diego boarded the Esperanza through the crew access gangway, pushing his cleaning cart ahead of him like he had hundreds of times before. The vessel felt different when it was docked and connected to shore power rather than operating under its own engines. The constant vibration of propulsion systems was replaced by the steady hum of electrical equipment and ventilation fans. Emergency lighting cast lengthy shadows through corridors that seemed wider and more empty than they did during active sailing activities when crew members were moving constantly throughout the ship. Diego began his cleaning routine on the upper decks, working his way systematically through zones that required attention while establishing his presence throughout the vessel for anyone who might be monitoring his movements through security cameras or direct observation. He emptied waste receptacles in the galley, cleaned restrooms used by crew members, and sanitized common zones where passengers would gather during future voyages. Every task was performed exactly according to his normal procedures, creating a detailed record of legitimate labor that would be documented by security systems positioned throughout the ship. The vessel's corridors were quieter than usual, with most of the crew either asleep or occupied with routine maintenance tasks that kept them away from zones where Diego was laboring. He could hear the distant sounds of harbor activities filtering through the hull, trucks moving freight, cranes loading containers, workers shouting instructions in multiple languages. However, inside the vessel, everything felt isolated from the outside world, creating the perfect environment for activities that required privacy and concentration. At 2:15 a.m., Diego positioned himself on Deck 2, directly above the restricted zone where Carlos and Miguel were maintaining their security watch over $11 million in criminal organization currency. He could hear their discussion clearly through ventilation openings as they discussed soccer matches, complained about the quality of food in the crew mess, and made plans for their time off when the vessel returned to Colombia. Their voices carried the relaxed tone of individuals who had settled into a comfortable routine and weren't expecting any problems during what had become a completely predictable assignment. At 2:45 a.m., Diego heard Carlos mention that it was almost time for their cigarette break. Following the same script that Diego had memorized during previous voyages, Miguel responded that he was looking forward to getting some fresh air after spending hours in the stuffy lower decks where ventilation was inadequate and the smell of fuel and cleaning chemicals created an oppressive atmosphere. Diego checked his watch and confirmed that they were following their established schedule exactly as he had observed during previous voyages, maintaining the punctuality that would prove to be their downfall. At exactly 3 a.m., both guards left their position and climbed toward the upper deck smoking zone, their footsteps echoing through the vessel's metal stairways as they moved away from the restricted section. Diego waited 60 seconds to ensure they had reached the designated smoking zone and settled into their routine, then moved quickly but quietly toward the Deck 3 access point, where $11 million was waiting for someone bold enough to take it. The corridor was empty and silent except for the steady background noise of vessel systems and distant harbor activities. Diego approached the maintenance panel that concealed access to the concealed compartment, using a small flashlight to illuminate the two padlocks that secured the false wall. His hands remained completely steady as he inserted lock-picking tools and began working on the first mechanism, applying techniques he had practiced hundreds of times until they became automatic. 43 seconds later, both locks were open, and Diego was staring at the largest amount of currency he had ever seen in one place. Inside the concealed compartment, 6 wooden containers arranged in 2 neat rows, each one vacuum sealed and wrapped according to professional smuggling procedures that protected currency from moisture, detection, and accidental damage. Diego could see official-looking stamps and markings that identified the contents as criminal organization currency being transported through an established distribution network that had been operating successfully for months or possibly years. The denominations were mixed, mostly 20s and 100s, bundled and sealed to survive months of storage in maritime conditions. Diego loaded 3 containers into his false bottom waste receptacles, working quickly but methodically to ensure that each receptacle was properly sealed and balanced for transport. He left the remaining 3 containers untouched, calculating that stealing exactly half the shipment would delay discovery of the theft and reduce the intensity of the investigation that would inevitably follow. A missing portion of the freight might be attributed to mistakes in counting or documentation, while a completely empty compartment would immediately trigger maximum security responses from both the criminal organization and law enforcement agencies. Diego covered the currency with legitimate waste from his cleaning activities throughout the vessel, creating layers of garbage that would provide realistic weight distribution and smell if anyone conducted casual inspection of the receptacles. Food scraps from the galley, empty containers from supply storage, used cleaning materials that would provide authentic odors. Each waste receptacle now looked and felt exactly like the ordinary trash that custodial workers removed from vessels after every cleaning duty. By 3:17 a.m., Diego was sealing the concealed compartment and replacing the padlocks in their original positions, leaving no trace that the security had been compromised. By 3:19 a.m., he was pushing 3 currency-filled waste receptacles toward the vessel's main exit, moving at the identical steady tempo he maintained during every cleaning activity. Carlos and Miguel were still on the upper deck, their cigarette breaks scheduled to last until 3:15 a.m., according to the routine Diego had observed repeatedly over months of careful surveillance. At 3:22 a.m., Diego approached the harbor security inspection point, wheeling 3 sealed receptacles that contained approximately $7 million in criminal organization currency. The guard on duty was reading a paperback novel and barely looked up as Diego approached with his cleaning equipment, treating the interaction as completely routine because he had processed Diego through the identical inspection point dozens of times over the previous 8 months. "Large mess tonight?" the guard inquired, making the type of casual discussion that had become routine during Diego's months of cleaning the Esperanza. "Identical as usual," Diego replied in the accented English that made him seem like exactly what he appeared to be, an immigrant laborer performing an honest job that nobody else wanted. Crew deck was quite difficult this time. The security guard directed him through without conducting any inspection of the waste receptacles or questioning why Diego might be departing slightly later than usual. Diego loaded the receptacles into his rental vehicle and drove calmly out of the harbor facility, taking the identical route he had used after dozens of legitimate cleaning duties. Nothing about his departure appeared unusual to anyone who might have been watching because Diego had successfully made the largest theft in maritime records appear exactly like routine waste removal. By 3:35 a.m., Diego was merging onto I-95 heading northward, beginning a carefully planned journey that would take him to Mexico and a completely new existence. In the back of his vehicle, $7 million in criminal organization currency was sealed inside receptacles that looked like ordinary trash from a routine cleaning activity. The theft had consumed exactly 18 minutes from start to finish. Clean, quiet, and virtually undetectable, Diego Ramos had just executed the perfect crime by perfecting the art of being invisible. Diego drove through the night using secondary roads and state highways that avoided major metropolitan zones where traffic cameras and automated license plate recognition systems were most concentrated. He had spent weeks studying route options that would minimize his electronic footprint while providing quick access to vehicle switching points he had established between Miami and the Mexican frontier. His first stop was a 24-hour storage facility outside Fort Lauderdale, where Diego transferred the currency to a modified pickup truck that he had purchased using false identification documents. The truck had concealed compartments built into its frame that could hide millions of dollars while appearing to carry legitimate freight like construction tools and building materials. Diego burned his Maritime Sanitation Services uniform, disposed of his harbor security credentials, and destroyed every piece of identification that connected him to his previous existence as a vessel custodian. At sunrise, Diego Ramos legally ceased to exist. The individual driving northward through Florida was now Miguel Santos, a construction contractor from Texas who was transporting building supplies to clients along the Gulf Coast. His new identity was supported by documentation that would pass routine inspection, bank accounts that showed appropriate financial history, and business records that explained his presence anywhere between Miami and the Mexican frontier. The investigation began 3 days later when criminal organization representatives discovered that half their shipment was missing. Carlos and Miguel were found dead in Cartagena Harbor. The FBI spent months reviewing security footage that showed nothing suspicious. Special Agent Maria Santos called it the most professional theft she had ever encountered. Diego was never found, and the $7 million was never recovered. In the criminal underworld, his robbery became legendary as proof that the perfect crime was possible for someone who understood how to become functionally invisible. The custodian had walked away with a fortune, leaving behind only security footage of an individual pushing a trash cart through a harbor facility in the middle of the night.